Hey, listeners, Tanner here with a little introductory note before we get into the recording. This is a follow-up to episode 115 on the Santo Cristo de Burgos, which first aired back on August 18th of this year. Our guest for this episode, Craig, has a really interesting perspective on the story due to his own personal connections to the wreck. Due to time constraints, some of the discussion did need to be cut out, but the episode as is has a ton of interesting insights that you wouldn't necessarily get just from reading the published information on the wreck. Thanks so much for your patience. We know it's been a long time since part 1, and we hope you enjoy part 2. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and I'll be joined on today's episode by a very special guest in just a minute here. So this is part 2 of an episode that we have been doing about the Santo Cristo de Burgos, also known as the Beeswax wreck. And in the first part of the episode, we discussed Spain's Manila galleon trade, and one galleon in particular, the Santo Cristo de Burgos. We tracked some of her final voyages, where she went through a fair amount of drama, leading up to her very last departure from the Philippines in 1693. Santo Cristo de Burgos failed to arrive in Acapulco as expected, disappearing basically without a trace and leaving no real indication of what may have happened to her contemporary chroniclers. However, relatively recently, the fate of the galleon has been more or less established. And today we are going to talk to someone who's been very heavily involved with the story of this wreck. So with that, I will bring in our guest for today, Craig Andes. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you for having me on board here.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity. I was really excited that we were able to talk to you and get you on the show. It's relatively rare that we get to talk to someone who has a personal connection to the stories that we cover here. So yeah, I know I was really excited to do this one. This is a time period that is of special interest to me, so very excited for this today. So I guess first, if you just want to introduce yourself a little bit, say a little bit about yourself and what you do, and kind of your connection to the area where the wreck is located.
So, well, thanks all the listeners out there for tuning into this. I live in the area of Rockaway Beach, north coast of Oregon. I've been out here since around 1987. Moved out here with my parents, went to school here. That's where I heard about the shipwreck and the Neocani treasure originally, and gained my interest in it. This is going to be kind of hard to fit into a single podcast. There's so much background story on the mysteries in this area. And a lot of them have been convoluted, with multiple shipwrecks and multiple stories and, a lot of falsified stories and people, treasure hunting in the past. And a lot of times they keep a lot of their secrets to themselves, and secrets are lost that way. So I've been studying this since about 87. I really got into it in about the 90s, about 96, 7. I kind of started investigating it a lot harder through archival research, and I have had a lot of various jobs in the area. I've done forest product work. I had an espresso shop, Lighthouse Espresso in Seaside. I used to run a North Coast Aquarium Maintenance was another business I had. I used to specialize in saltwater marine aquariums and take care of other people's aquariums. Primarily for the last over a decade have been commercial fishing. Started that in 99 and worked in all the different fisheries for the most part, but primarily now I run a commercial clam business called Clam Up Fisheries here in Tillamook Bay. I've got a couple of boats. We dive and harvest clams, which is the true treasure. And I also am a beekeeper. I have a extremely small micro honey and pollen company called Neocani Gold. And I've done a lot of mining in the past, engineering and welding and been a real avid rock hound and mineral, searcher out there in the hills, looking for all those kind of mysteries as well that I've heard about. So that's kind of what I do. I do a lot of beachcombing in my spare time. My business is, real good for me to be able to have a lot of extra spare time. We dive, we only work a few hours a day. Usually, it's not a full-time 8-hour a day job every day. So in my spare time, I've dug into all this research and spent a lot of time out searching and looking for the clues, following them, and working with Scott Williams, the Naga Beeswax project that was formed back in 2006. But I can elaborate on that in a minute.
So yeah, I mean, obviously you've got a wide array of experience and knowledge, in the area. When you were first kind of getting interested in this and you were first finding stuff, how long did it really take you to realize that these pieces that you were finding, specifically these wooden pieces, that this was something from a shipwreck rather than just, this is just driftwood?
When it comes to the wood that I found from the ship in the caves, which was not the first items I found from the ship by far, I knew instantly, for the most part, what it was I was looking at. However, I did see the wood beam sticking up out of the sand back in 2013. I went back through some photo archives I had, and sure enough, it was there in one of them. And I'd taken a kind of a hard look at it, but there wasn't enough exposed, but the very, very rounded end of it sticking out of the sand. And I do remember thinking that's some kind of strange looking wood, but didn't put an ID on it at the time. I was more or less focused on searching for the trail of porcelain that had been washing ashore for centuries, and beeswax from the wreck.
Mm-hmm.
The wood was real obvious to me, and it was the spike holes in it, it was the shape, it was the hardness. In 2019, that's when I really found it and knew what it was without any doubt. And that same day, I found, I think, 3 other pieces of, identical wood out in the same cave system. The big beam I found was trapped and wedged in the bedrock of the cave, on the floor of the cave. And I found around into the next cave, what you would call a ship's knee. It's the support for a deck, and it had a very particular shape to it. And that really, like, 100% confirmed, the first beam that I saw just around the corner, the same day. And I called up, Scott Williams, who I'd been working with since the original Naga Beeswax project, and they'd come in. I'd been sharing information and data with them, trying to further research on this. And I called him up, just, kind of giddy, excited. So yeah, that's kind of how that went. And then the story kind of progresses from there.
How did you first get into contact with Scott Williams and the rest of the research team?
I was in the Manzanita Fresh Foods grocery store one day, and I looked down, and the paper there had Beeswax Wreck written on the front page. And so I grabbed a copy and went home and read it excitedly because, I thought, all right, there's some other people that are interested in this besides me. Maybe we can further the research here with, my data and theirs. And I was skeptical. Most people come in and looking for wrecks or treasure hunters and, are usually all about themselves. And so I was skeptical, and I contacted them through information, just got their phone numbers from information, and called Rick Rogers and Scott Williams and David Chafee up and, asked them what was going to be going on out here with the first Naga Beeswax meeting. And they were going to come out here and get kind of a gathering of locals and find out any more data that might be missing. There was a guy named Ed Giesick, and he'd been working on this for most of his life, and his health was failing, and they wanted to really, step up and get him some answers. And that was kind of the basis of the original Naga Beeswax project. Rick Rogers, who passed away a few years ago in a plane wreck, tragically, was actively searching in Hawaii for a galleon in, I think, Cook Inlet, but I'm not sure. And he'd found what they'd thought was it underneath a magma flow. They thought they'd found cannons. And so he wanted to come out here for another project and make some, headway and tracks in order to gain some traction in order to do a project in Hawaii. And that was a part of the interest that Rick had. And David Chafee was working with the larger Naga archaeology group and started this Naga Beeswax group here for research. And that kind of progressed, slowly over the years. Mostly because it was volunteers, and a lot of people don't have the same time schedule to take the time off to go be involved. So it was over the long term of the years, it was kind of complicated for us to really further hard research as a large group. But things happened. We got out there. We did a cesium magnetometer survey on the Cape Falcon with Brenner Sheldon, and who invented the cesium mag. Got a lot of good information on multiple potential offshore wreck sites, and made a lot of friends in the group, lifelong friends, and a lot of interesting data that we've discovered about the tsunami involved with the shipwreck, the spread of the porcelain around, and that was kind of what Rick Rogers had asked me to do, was to really focus on trying to track a trail of the porcelain, which I'd already been doing. I'd already found a few pieces over the years, looking along the beaches and in the edges of the rivers where they had washed out of old camps.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of how it kind of ramped up in 2006 after my own basic decade of research that I'd been doing, archival research. I'd been kind of a treasure hunter more or less before that as a kid. And over the years, I met a guy named William Kurt, who has done a lot of archaeological work. He was my neighbor. He's a genius when it comes to understanding the environment around and all the plants and animals. He studied a lot of the native lore, and he kind of, in a sense, helped open my eyes more up to the historical aspects of all this, and that's when I had started that more heavy research in 1996, and moved on from there. So over the years, the Naga Beeswax project did what we could, and then it got retired when David Chafee retired, and Scott had formed MAS, the Marine Archaeological Survey, and continued to work. Well, actually, Scott didn't. I think Chris Dewey formed MAS, but Scott and a whole bunch of people were on the team. I never officially joined their team because I'd have to sign off on sharing data, and since a great majority of the data I had collected that I'd shared with them was mine, I just continued to work, hand in hand with Scott and Rick and a couple other people that came along, Mitch Markham, my friend Ty Grabowski that I met the first year at the first Naga camp has been one of my more influential research partners, and other than Scott. But there's been a lot of go-ats trying to get this, find this, ship. The natives pretty much told the story, and I feel like I pretty much confirmed that story, which was I can get into in a little bit.
Yeah. I definitely want to come back to talk about the tsunami later, because we didn't really talk about much past the ship leaving port in our first part of the episode. So that's definitely I don't think I included it in the question list, but definitely want to talk about the tsunami and the role that plays in the wreck. So yeah, I was just kind of curious on kind of on a human emotional level here. You were very big on pushing to get these timbers tested and verified as to where they came from. What was your motivation? What about this really caused you to sort of latch onto it and really push for more research to be done on this wreck?
Well, I've been collecting the porcelain pieces as clues off the beach for quite a few years, and conversations I'd had with Scott, porcelain, broken porcelain, it's going to maybe shed some clues, and it did, on the era of the ship and what the cargo had been, most likely from either the San Francisco Javier of 1705 or the Santo Cristo de Burgos of 1693 were both matching candidates for the porcelain that Jessica Lilly had done a master's thesis on and got us our mean dates on during the first couple of years of the Naga project. And I'm not the only person, that's been collecting the porcelain on the beaches. Locals have been finding and collecting it for as long as it's happened, probably.
Mm-hmm.
The natives, I'm sure, picked a lot of it up. There's been porcelain bowls and stuff like that found in some of the major dig sites where they were doing studies on the camps in the past. The reason I really started pushing hard after I found the beams in the cave was because some of them are pinned loosely under rocks, and some of them were floating around freely, or not floating, but washing around freely, that had been previously wiggled out from underneath rocks from storms and stuff, and then bashing around there like driftwood in the caves, wearing apart, losing their identity as parts of the ship, to where it's really hard to tell whether it's just a piece of driftwood or the ship. And most of the pieces that are exposed are very rounded and very water worn, but there were very key, obvious elements to them, with the spike holes and the way certain water was wearing on them, of what they were, and very different type of wood from the other wood in the caves, very camouflaged in the tide pools. I can very much see how nobody else ever recognized any of it, for the most part, for what it was. I did have some people come forward, in later years and say, "Hey, I found this out there while I was looking for rocks years ago. Do you think this is it? The same stuff?" And I would be, yeah, that is, or that isn't. Most of the time that isn't. But other locals have found the wood debris here and there. There was a block from the ship. There was a round wheel from a ship. A friend of mine named James had found a little piece of wood and had been looking around, for agates when he'd found it, but didn't know what it was until I actually was with him out at the cave and showed him, the beam and the other stuff that was still out there. I'd recruited a couple of friends after going out there by myself a lot, which is really extremely dangerous. And I just started, for my own safety, because I'd usually only go out, like maybe make a trek out to those areas once a year to search around over the years. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really a major focal point of mine because of the access, more or less. I mostly was focusing on trying to concentrate on finding some markings on porcelain and stuff like that would maybe be the smoking gun to the, this is the Santo Cristo de Burgos, or this right. is the San Francisco Javier, or something else. But when I saw the wood washing around out there, I was just super concerned. And, Scott was like, well, it's driftwood, because and with, like I said earlier, everybody's schedules, it's really hard for people that are to have the time to come down and be able to get away from normal life or their job and come down, because, I'm down here saying, hey, I found something. So even though we've all been working hand in hand and on this project for a long time, he was extremely skeptical. I mean, he wasn't the only one. I talked to many other shipwreck salvers that had worked on galleons in the past, and they all said the same thing. Absolutely not. You're not going to find any wood from the ship. It's all rotted away from the worms and the environment. And so, I was a tad bit skeptical, maybe a couple percent skeptical that what I'd found was going to be from something more modern, but it was just so much different type of wood from any of the 1800s wrecks that are, exposed on our beaches here at times, that I just knew it was special. And with Scott not being able to get out here to ID it and all that, he was saying, well, it's driftwood on the coast of Oregon. You can keep a yard of driftwood a year. bring it home. Maybe it'll turn out to be something. And so I did. And at one point in time, everybody was skeptical. Rick, Mitch, everybody, maybe not Ty, everybody. And I just needed to push to make sure that stuff was, got out of there one way or the other. I wanted to see that beam because I knew it was like so special, recovered. And it wasn't going to be easy because it was huge. And I carried the ship's knee out the day I found it because it was loose. It was just laying on the bedrock. And it took me 3 days to carry it out of the cave systems.
Wow.
It also took me 2 weeks to heal my herniated disc in my neck that I've injured years ago afterward, because it was like that strenuous. It was probably 150 to 200 pounds when it was still wet. And, and I'm talking a pretty intricate hike to get it out of there. And so when I built my own little conservation lab and started treating all the wood I found with the help of my friend Ty, who used to work as a dive investigator. And he's done a lot of shipwreck salvage and salvage of other things in the past in his job. Anyway, I went to nobody still had a chance to come down and lay eyes on it other than some of my friends. And when the Shipwreck conference happened there, and I think it was in 2019, and Jim Delgado was coming out to speak, and Scott had asked me to get a couple samples to send in for carbon dating. At that point, I had brought those up to the Shipwreck conference and gave them to Scott, showed the videos I'd taken of everything out there. And honestly, everybody said, no, Craig, those are just, parts of a dock or whatever, because nobody had actually laid fingers or hands on any of it yet.
Right.
And I thought, well, I'll try to get this, show this video to Jim Delgado. And I went out in the lobby, went during the break during his talks, and there was about a line of about 50 people lined up to talk to him. And I thought, well, that ain't going to happen because the break's about over. and all of a sudden, everybody walked away, and he was sitting there by himself. And I thought, well, there's the chance. So I walked over and I played the video for him, and his initial reaction was, yeah, you found something major. And that was a lot of kick in the butt for me to go push harder to see this recovered. And at that point in time, Scott got the carbon dates back a little bit later and was like, oh my, and called me up and said, Craig, you can tell me you told me so. And I was like, well, it's not about that, Scott. It's about, let's just figure this out. Let's get this stuff out of there ASAP. And this was during COVID. And I thought, man, this is going to be some really delightful news during all these dark times. But for whatever reason, apparently, we stepped over somebody's toes and There was talk about getting the stuff out of there. There was a large push from Jim and his company Search and a ton of locals, but we just kept getting told no, we couldn't go to the caves. And I was even told if I went out to the caves again, I'd probably be arrested.
And if I remember correctly from our conversation, and this pushback that you were getting, was this from the state park? Is that correct?
Mainly it was from the local state park management. Okay. It wasn't coming out of, Salem. All the state parks are compartmentalized in Oregon. And so, some of the people that really needed to know never heard about it, which is tragic. And some very important pieces were not only damaged, but lost. That I'm the only person that ever laid hands on them, eyes on them, and recorded them in sight, in situ or in, they're loose moving around in the caves. After, frequenting the site all summer while I was trying to convince Scott, when he was saying, gather some of those loose pieces up. Don't take anything out of situ, but, gather some of those loose pieces up that are floating around so we don't lose them. And, they can go up to the museum. And that's what I did. And during that period of time, I was more or less just doing my own research. I'm not an archaeologist, but I've got a ton of experience in, mining, geology, fishing, the ocean, the marine environment, because I, used to run a saltwater aquarium maintenance business. I even had, clownfish, breeding in my tanks. I even crossbred blue stripe clownfish with a tomato clownfish in my aquariums. I had my fish so happy. But I definitely, was doing my own research out there. And during that period of time of studying these pieces that were coming out from under the rocks, I was very, aware that there's a lot of material trapped under the slide, which is one of the stories the natives told. They said the mountain came down on the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Most everybody's always assumed Neoconi Mountain because the iconic name and the treasure, and that's where most treasure hunts had always been going on. And there are probably wood and pieces of the ship trapped under rocks under Neoconi Mountain that also had fallen down on the ship during the 1700 earthquake. We'll get into that later, but the bottom line is there was a lot out there. I was finding porcelain and pieces of other debris coming up out there. I found metal chain from the wreck. I found a very large suspected anchor that's buried out there and concreted from the wreck. We went out there a couple of times with the MASS group to do further survey in that summer once they had time and we got organized enough to get people out there. We did metal detecting out there to see if there were any other anomalies. Really didn't find any major anomalies with the smaller metal detectors at that time, but later I took a really high grade metal detector out there and I identified what I think are buried under a lot of large rocks, too big to move any easy at all. Some of the size of cars and trucks and school buses. There's one area in particular where there's 4 or 5 anomalies of non-ferrous metal, which I think are the bronze cannons, and they're spaced out about what cannons would be on a ship. And it's also right through the largest section of where what I would say some ribs and some other features of the wreck are sticking up out throughout these rocks that, are getting kind of worn down as the rocks wear down around them.
Mm-hmm.
That whole area was full of sand and cobble, and I'm not sure, but I think it was the 2018 like 33-foot swell that we had come in that was very south facing, had disrupted a lot in there and pulled a lot of that material out. An interesting note I'd made was that a lot of the beeswax that's been found on the beaches over the years has strange shapes to it, as if it was squeezed out like frosting between rocks. And so, and I was thinking the same thing about porcelain for a lot of years. And I was basing all this off the original native story that, rocks had fell on the wreck. And I assumed these little fragments of porcelain I was finding over the years were working their way up from underneath rocks as they settled in the surf. And I'm pretty sure we can confirm that with further studies. And the same with the beeswax and other materials, because it was a common occurrence in the past during giant southerly storms that they would find candles and beeswax on the beaches, always after a southerly. And the way that area of the cliffs and caves are kind of protected, it takes a very, very southerly swell for there to be a lot of wave action in there. So that's one of the things that's protected the wood in there, which is a whole other story of how the wood has been preserved in the site.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest things I was wondering about this, because I know you had mentioned obviously the kind of gut reaction from everyone is there's no way that there's still timbers from this from something so old, and so I was just curious about what is it about the area, the caves, the places that you were finding these pieces of wood that does allow these things to be preserved for much longer than we might expect.
I'd say there's 3 major factors as to why I think the wood was preserved as well as it has been compared to other shipwrecks around the world of its era. It had the 1700 mega thrust Cascadia event earthquake, and this ship was probably wrecked right on the shore there and pushed up against the cliffs from storms. It wrecked in 1693, and the earthquake happened in 1700, January 26th of 1700. And there was 8 years, I think that's 8 years, between the time the ship was on the shore somewhere on the Oregon coast, close to the area. I think it was south. Scott believes it was south too, here on the beaches by Rockaway Beach and Manhattan Beach. Probably there's a couple of scenarios how it got there. It either just broke up and was washed up there in sections, or a large section of it. I may have only found one section of it that managed to survive being trapped because it was trapped under the rocks. The fact that it takes a while for a tsunami to make it to shore, but the earthquake was instant. The ship being washed into the caves or up against the cliffs allowed for the cliffs to collapse on it, protecting it from the massive tsunami that came in. The debris field that extends down the coast, mainly, I would say mostly between Netarts and up the coast to Tillamook Head, is, broken shards of porcelain in that range, and beeswax out further from that because it floats further and isn't just washed on the bottom by ocean currents. But it seems like there was a lot of that material moved around prior to the earthquake happened, or at the same time, either from the storms prior or when the ship was removed off the beach by the Spaniards to repair it. They would have taken it off of Rockaway Beach, probably taking it up to Short Sands and tried to careen it up there, potentially getting burnt out by the natives or just a storm coming in and wrecking it further into the cliffs there. But either way, it was parts of it ended up in the caves under the rocks. And, you can just envision a cave, with sea waves breaking into it, breaking a very sturdy ship up and kind of pushing it into the back of the caves, parts of it. And I got a feeling that somebody else had that theory with the fact they put the Goonies movie out the way they did with the ship in the cave in the end. So I think there was, other evidence of people have found it there. And I don't think that I'm the first person to have found the shipwreck wood out there and know what it was. I think Ross Cox, that was the person that put the highway in, the 101 down the coast, had a good knowledge of where it was at. Ben Lane probably knew where it was because he was, collecting wood and making canes and tables and stuff and giving it to locals. Pat Smith and his father was half native, Solomon Smith, searched for the shipwreck for years and recovered wood. And he had a large giant beam at his house that he would tell people, if you can move this, you can have it. And nobody could because it was so heavy. He also had built a house there on the face of Neocani at another site where I think the ship might have rested for a while as it moved up the coast, because there's a lot of debris in that area as well. And there's some other things there. There's a cabin in some of the first cabin that was built on Neocani Mountain. If you take a hard look at the pictures of it, it's got ship beams in it and with curvature to them. So I do believe that other people had found possibly either other locations of the wood or somehow managing to get that wood out of those caves and all the way over the Neocani Mountain without a road back in the day. And that makes me suspicious that it was another site, because if Pat Smith had pieces over there that couldn't be moved, then, how did he get them there?
Right.
That leads, credence to the original story that the ship, and the other original studies that the ship wrecked on the Nehalem Beach or the Manhattan Beach area, at the mouth of the Nehalem, and then broke up and then somehow over the years got pushed into the caves. I do believe the section of the ship I found is a lower section, and I believe it's this part of maybe the kitchen section of the ship, because I found a lot of coal in there. Okay. I found some, like what you'd call fire bricks and some things like that might have been from that part. Some of the beams, the big beam itself, in fact, is a lower hull piece of wood, more than likely. The angle of the ship's knee for the angle of the side of the hull to the deck would tell me that it's an upper section of the decks. So that would, with the big beam being a bottom, I think there's a whole, at least side of the ship laying on its side underneath most of the rocks out in the caves. And until we get out there and we're allowed by state parks to do further research, that material that's being damaged and destroyed out there on a daily basis by the tides is just losing us information. Mm-hmm. Most of the shipwreck wood out there is very pinned. It would take some very hard work to excavate and remove and get down into it. It's possible. We have the technology, but it at least needs to be, as a site, looked at a lot harder at what's still sticking up out there. I don't want to see anybody out there, messing with it. In a sense, it's a shipwreck site now. It's not to be disturbed, and I will not be happy if there's people out there disturbing what needs to be looked at. The big pieces of wood and some of them that we lost due to delays, will probably never be seen again. I actually bought a $500 acoustic tracker and put it in a piece of the wood out there and left it to see where it might travel on the bottom of the ocean to a collection point where maybe more of the ship is gone, but we've never been able to follow up on that. Sadly, because of mostly constraints. So the other reason that the wood was preserved in there, because I think I really only hit on the first reason, which was the rock slide, is there's very little wave action in there because of its kind of wrapped around Shelter Cove area. That beach is kind of south facing anyway, and so west swells go in there, north swells miss it. South swells come in there and make really great surf. The other main reason that the wood preserved as long as it did is the rocks out there are all full of sulfides and sulfur ore type sulfides. And we've done some XRF analysis of some of the minerals that are out there, and that's a whole nother story. But I believe that the rocks breaking down around the wood and that are sitting on the wood are so heavily sulfured mudstone, and it's just keeping the worms from getting into it. It's kind of like mineralizing and petrifying the wood. It'd be interesting to take some, regular samples of the same wood and some same exact size samples of the wood that I found and see if there's a very drastic weight and mineral difference in them. And what that, analysis would tell us, I think, would be a lot. But that's probably the main reason, I think, that besides the wave action and the shelteredness of it and the rocks, that the wood was preserved is, I don't think the worms, like the sulfur that's breaking down out of the rocks. Plus there's zinc in the rocks and lead in the rocks and, little traces of silver and traces of nickel and titanium and a bunch of arsenic in the rocks out there. So, between the arsenic and the sulfur and the zinc, the zinc's acting as a natural zinc, like a boat, zinc does to protect it. That's why I believe the chain and some of the other metal out there that I found is being preserved, immaculately, considering the surf conditions and stuff. And so that I believe is why the wood that I found has managed to survive, whereas wood from other ships of the same era, aren't subjected to all of those minerals, and they're just subjected to ocean water and the sediments of the mud on the bottom, and worms live in mud. So
yeah, it makes sense to me. If I was a worm, I would not want to hang out in the arsenic and sulfur area, probably. So yeah, that's fascinating. I have very, very minimal knowledge of anything involving geology or any of those, but yeah, that's a fascinating sort of explanation for what is unique about why are these timbers being preserved when, as you mentioned, in other cases they probably wouldn't.
The whole sulfur mineral thing is a whole nother, something I was studying. I found a piece of what old timers would call compactite or cementite in a crab pot that came up. And my first thought was, oh, that's cement, but it wasn't. It was a spherical fallout gravel that had been silicated together over the years from water action, but in it was these silver pyrite cubes. And considering this came out of the ocean, and iron pyrite usually breaks down really fast in salt water, I got a really strong interest into what it was. And so, over the little while after that, I ended up buying basically an entire assay lab and taught myself how to do fire assays and blowpipe assays, and started, researching the different mineral, strikes that I had found throughout the area, and found, a mass variety of different stuff in the area that most people has never even spoken about, everything from cobalt to some pretty interesting sulfide mineral ores. So there's not a lot of like gold in the area. If there's like actual real, gold in its form, it's like microscopic almost. It's like sugar gold. So it's beach gold and very small stuff. There's no real big, nuggets of gold in this northwest part of the coast that I'm aware of, and I think I would know.
Right. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the area that this stuff has been found in, and so for those of our listeners who haven't checked out the Drain the Oceans episode, can you just kind of, I guess, describe the area where these pieces are? I know earlier you mentioned going out to see some of the stuff on your own and how that's, kind of a dangerous proposition. So can you just kind of describe what this area looks like, kind of geographically, topographically? What kind of area are we dealing with here?
It's a pretty complex area. It's a very beautiful, one of the most beautiful places on the coast, sheltered cove, short sands beach, and it's surrounded by steep cliffs. They're very loose and mudstone shale, mostly. There is a hard bedrock basalt layer underneath all of the sedimentary layers there. It's a very ancient flow that I think dates clear back to when it was, still connected to New Zealand and Australia. Mostly because I took some minerals to the Rock, Rice, and Mineral Museum, and the first reaction was, "Where'd you get these at, New Zealand?" So,
so you talked a little bit about the area. This is in terms of size, or like the range of that these pieces have been found in on the coast here. What if you could give an approximation of I don't know, a north-south window of what's the area that these things are being found in?
The porcelain, I would say, that's washing up on the beaches is little broken shards of blue and white pottery, and some other odd colors sometimes, would range basically from the knee tarts area, south of Tillamook Bay, to basically the Tillamook Head area. That's kind of where the water currents, kind of shoot offshore, and the influence of the Columbia River, having currents coming south, everything kind of meets out there and settles. Things don't have a tendency to make it around Tillamook Head. So with the beeswax, there's been pieces found as far away as Florence. They could be from another wreck. There's other stories of wrecks on the coast that I can talk about later. But some of the beeswax, found like down at Florence, or, all up and down the coast, that can travel a long ways. I mean, I imagine you could theoretically find a piece of beeswax from this down at Baja, Mexico. But,
right.
That would, there's no way to, determine what wreck or where it came from. The piece that's from Florence is kind of interesting because it has and it's down at the Nehalem Valley Historical Society. You can go in and look at it, along with the ship knee and a couple cannonballs and a couple other artifacts, and a really great, setup of displays about local history down at the Nehalem Valley Historical Society. But the wax they have in there, that was the one that was found in Florence, has actual raccoon tracks on it that were like, because it was hot and the raccoon walked across it. But one of the interesting other features of it is it looks like it was squeezed out like a piece of frosting, between something. And that has very rock shapes to it. And out at the caves where I found the wood at, there is a very large group of raccoons. So, what are the odds of a raccoon walking across the dune and deciding to walk over a chunk of beeswax and step on it, as opposed to a piece of beeswax stuck in the rocks out there and coons scurrying around it. Plus, it's a south-facing parable, and so it gets really hot in there. I went out there in the summer, and it must have been 90 degrees at super low tide, and the whole upper half of that beam was out of the water and hot to the touch. So the fact that that wood is so well preserved and petrified that it can handle getting wet and dry and hot and cold like that for so many years, even the amount of time I watched the beam stuck there before we managed to get it, or before they managed to get it recovered, I was surprised that it was holding up. And I watched it, to survive a couple of pretty, epic storms out there. I honestly did not think that that beam, the way it was wedged in there, was going to survive, another winter, although I had hope because I had gone back through my video archive and saw a picture of it in the same place in 2013. But then it had a bunch of stuff holding it down. When I had found it, it was nothing but it being kind of wedged in the crack there. So went out the next summer there in 2020, and it was loose. And then by the time in 2021 they got back out there, I'd gone out there a couple of times. It had kind of refastened itself into the crack. Mm-hmm. And there were some other pieces that were laying around out there that I was trying to keep from washing away. They were too large. There was a really large rib, like a bent rib. There's only a couple of other people's photos of it, and I have a few photos of it, and it managed to survive the winter, but it broke in half. I'd actually tied it up with crab rope that I'd found out there and tied it to a big rock and in locations thinking it might be a little bit more protected, but it didn't manage to stay there. It was and over the period of 2 years there before we managed to get out there to recover stuff, it ended up disappearing during one of the October storms. You had asked me about the general description of the area, and I hadn't quite finished that when I tracked there. But, the general area of the caves is, as opposed to the rest of what I'd said earlier about short sands in the area, it's basically some really large sea caves, very loose shale material above them. That's, it's not one of those places that you can rappel to. It's not one of those places that you can get into during, any tide, unless it's a super minus tide. And then you have a super short window to be able to do anything in there, about a half hour safe time. Otherwise you'll get trapped on a couple of the exit points. There's one particular area that you have to kind of like literally slide down like the Goonies to get in there, or you have to, crawl down a kind of a sketchy spot on the rocks to get there where, if you slip either way, you go down the slide and you start sliding, and you can only do it at certain times of the year because it's usually covered with algae from the water, running out of the cliffs. But, you're going to go visit Davy Jones in his locker. Like that's where that slide leads. And that's where the coming off the rocks there to get into that area is. And, then there's a couple other, what I call pinch points that you're either going to have to swim around if you get in there too long or whatever. And then if you were to try to stay out there throughout a whole tide, you'd get crushed by the waves and, tide if there's, wave action. If it's a glassy flat, you could probably stay, snorkel around out there. Sometimes it's like a pond out there. But we removed all the, wood and the material that, we were afraid of that anybody else could get a hold of and walk off with for the most part. Everything that is still out there is very pinned, under vehicle-sized rocks, some smaller rocks, but some rocks are almost as big as a microbus that were sitting on some of these pieces of wood and are still. And it's just a really, extreme kind of environment. I've kind of nicknamed the big cave Cathedral Cave because it's just like this giant mouth. There's no column supports in it. It looks like at any point in time the whole thing's just gonna crunch. And that was the cave that the big beam was in. And that was another reason I was concerned about making sure we get that stuff out of there, because it's only going to take one rock slide and nobody will be able to research that stuff for another 300 years. So
Right.
it's kind of paramount that we can get a team out there and start doing, further research.
Yeah, I think it's interesting with stories like this, and how a story like this one that develops over the span of centuries, and now when it comes down to it, there is a bit of a time is a factor. You talking about the next time there's a rock slide, the stuff could be gone, more or less for good for our purposes. Yeah, it's fascinating how these historical stories interact with the present.
Yeah, it's been there for 328 years, but it's one of these critical moments. It's obviously been buried, in all the other locals and stuff that have been trying to find it. We're missing it because it was probably buried. Um, Step back, you can add this in to the earlier thing, but the Ross Cox guy that was putting in the highway. So Ross Cox that was putting in the highway, the Coast Highway. I have some really old, like 1909 photos that a guy named Don Best shared with me. He was doing also a lot of research and grew up in this area his whole life. He shared some photos with me of a road that goes straight to the caves. And I wouldn't know I wouldn't say necessarily a road, but something large enough that you could probably drag, cannons up with a team of horses. And it's the only photos I've ever saw of this very obvious trail that was going directly to the cave that I found the wood in. So I do believe that, Pat Smith, Ross Cox, some of the past, Ben Lane, those three in particular may have known the location of the cave, unless they were finding wood in another site.
I did have a question here. So you talked a little bit about what this is like on shore, the caves, the area. What's the seabed like in this area? Is this the type of seabed where stuff would be likely to sink, into the mud, into the sand, or is this, a rockier, harder bottom where stuff would stay exposed?
Well, there's a lot of sand on the beach, and it moves around, and there's a lot of large cobble, and it also moves around. And over the years, the porcelain, that's been washing around from the wreck, mostly in the cove, is buried down in all those cobbles below the sand. There's no mud in the area, and below the cobble is bedrock. So the beauty about this site is there's a very prevalent bedrock slope uh, going out there, and it's almost like a wash pan. It's got a lot of grooves in it, and in those grooves, I thought I was going to start, probably finding coins and other really cool things, but no, it's probably all still 4 or 5 feet under giant rocks that are, pinning it all down. If there's are cannons that are in the site out there, they're going to be, judging from the steepness of the slope and the way the rocks are set up in there, and I believe concreted and held in there by the material below them from the iron, dissolving and concreting. I believe that none of the material really sunk away in the mud. Now, I know all the way offshore, clear out to 80 fathoms and stuff, drag fishing and stuff like that out there, that a lot of pieces of porcelain have been found in the past by fishermen and wax in their pots. In fact, right after the 2 days, I think, after we were done filming the National Geographic Drain the Ocean show, one of the crabbers came walking down the dock that I'd never met before from the Columbia River, had pulled into Garibaldi, and he says, "Hey, you're that guy." Actually, it was after the film came out. It was a week after the film came out. He goes, "Hey, you're that guy." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, my deckhand found this beeswax in this crab pot last week, right up there by where you're at, And I was like, "Oh." And he's like, "It's a perfectly round ball with gravel embedded in it." And so sure enough, I got to look at it, and it's sure enough, it's beeswax been rolling around out there on the bottom, turned into a perfect ball. Got a bunch of little gravel pecked into it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But so, there is mud out there, and some of that stuff might go out offshore and sink. I invited Bill Mathers up, that had found the Concepcion, to talk to him about theory and show him the site and ask if he had any insights for me. And he actually was one of the two people that kind of led me to start looking a little harder out further, as opposed to, just on the sandy beaches for material. And, because one of his comments was, these big terracotta jars that all the other wrecks that he'd seen had rolled offshore with the wave action on the bottom and settled out past, where 35-foot swell and stuff like that settling the stuff out at. And so, being that I'd found terracotta and more terracotta out those caves, it was sort of like kind of one of those little bit of a, maybe an aha moment that my idea about the rock slides on that side was probably right. I think it was a few years before that, I'd met a guy on the beach that was also looking for porcelain. And that's kind of where the story in the Daily Astoria comes up, just searching for agates, because,
Right.
when you're down on the beach and you're looking around and you see another guy looking and you're looking for, these clues to what you kind of consider a tad bit of a secret research project, because you don't want other people grabbing a bunch of what you're trying to look for. But at the same time, I'm very supportive of other people going down and enjoying themselves and doing, and finding things on the beach. And this porcelain, there was 92,000 pieces of porcelain, probably more than that, on this ship in the cargo. And, you take a porcelain bowl and you shatter it, and now you've got, 500 pieces. Now you take that 92,000 pieces and you start thinking about how many actual pieces, if it wasn't salvaged off the wreck, were breaking up in the surf. And people are going to be finding this for the next 1,000 years on the beaches.
Right.
Because it's so durable. The ceramic is so durable compared to glass in the sand that it doesn't wear out. And it has slight little micro bubbles in it that actually make it slightly buoyant. And it's what helps it wash up on the beaches. And I have a whole complex understanding of the way they're moving around out there in the sands and in the ship from the ship site and up and down on the beaches and in the cobbles. And I can pretty much go to the beach if I go out and search and find a minimum of one piece. I usually find it's very strange, in 1, 3s, 5s, 7s, and odd numbers. I hardly ever find 2 pieces or 4 pieces or 6 pieces. It's always an odd number. And if I go back through my, archive of all the porcelain that's up at the museum, which I have, archived by date and stuff, it's just it kind of baffles me, like, why odd numbers all the time. It's kind of creepy. But there's this porcelain moving around in the sand continuously. The people will be finding, whether you're supposed to pick it up or not. It's not in situ anymore. It's not going to tell us what wreck it is. It doesn't have the same kind of maybe value archaeologically as it did prior to us finding the wood and discovering more, because it was one of our kind of main understanding research tools. So at this point in time, I believe and that it's something that's important for, the tourism of the Oregon coast. And in fact, I have a lawyer and maybe 2 separate firms of lawyers working on the prospect of making sure that's something that can be done by the public, because I found this ship, and under international maritime law, I own the ship. But under international maritime law, the King of Spain has made a stance in the past, and he owns his ships. There's kind of a common, it's kind of common in international law that if a country didn't continue looking for a ship, and there wasn't continual research being done on it, and it was abandoned, that when the finder finds it, it's theirs. And but there's a law in Oregon that says the state of Oregon owns it. So everything's kind of in limbo right now until it gets sorted out as to whose is what. I personally don't want the shipwreck to go out and salvage it for a bunch of treasure and be rich off of it. I want to know more about it. I want to know the story. I want to see the site protected and studied properly. I want to see people to be able to contribute to finding things on the beach, be excited about it, and contact, the Mass Maritime Archaeological Society, have them take the porcelain up there, get their name on a plaque for helping, whatever it takes to get the public's interest involved in, helping to further understand this, as opposed to, going out and, maybe pillaging it. There's not going to be, anything to pillage off of that ship site, really, without a massive, excavation help, and professionals out there. I would like to see the graves that I know about from the shipwreck site. There's a couple of probably large mass graves that were buried up on the land. You can add this into the native story part later, but one of the native stories of the shipwreck is a large procession of people going up the hill and burying a large black chest in the mountain, and then killing a slave on top of it so the natives wouldn't interfere with it. It's not very, common to carry heavy treasure up a mountain. There's really no point in it unless you're afraid of the tsunami getting it. So there's a little bit of that there. But at the same time, the Spanish were one of the, only, countries that didn't throw their dead over at sea. They were to be buried on land in Catholic burial. And so the people that had potentially, perished on the ship were probably what the large procession up the mountain was about. And there's some areas, and I won't say where, that are unknown, probably more than likely, the grave sites. And I'd like to see that protected as a monument to Spain. And for what it is, I don't want to see it disturbed. It's in an area that nobody's going to find or disturb very easily. And I don't think very many people, I don't think hardly anybody knows about it. There's a couple of people that have done research that probably come across it. That's, it's a spot that's not even a site yet, that needs to be a site. That's very not too far from the ship. Plus, I found what I believe is a mine shaft that was targeting the minerals that I was speaking about. And I believe it's the vault to the ship. I believe that is what the native legend is about them burying stuff in solid bedrock below the ship because it was too heavy. And so if you listen to the native stories, why would you carry gold up the hill? They even mentioned that it was too heavy to remove from the ship, and that would have been like cannons maybe and some other stuff. One of the other stories I remember reading in the past in the native archives was they carried blankets of sand up the mountain for like a year, and it took me a long time to try to wrap my head around why would you carry sand from the beach up the hill. But that would have been a very good way to protect the porcelain from dinging around. So you could sit it in your and that's just a thought. Might have been making a sand trap for their vault, but the Goonies sand trap. So I would like to see further research done on a couple of locations in there and around the area, including the site where the mercury was found, because that ship was carrying 2 tons of mercury or 3 tons of mercury in leather bags and wooden barrels. And I don't want to really bring it up as to where that was found or by who, because there's still a bunch of research being done. But, there was the mercury probably taken off the ship, because I had actually taken some of the sawdust from the samples I'd cut, which I did very reluctantly, to send in for carbon dating. I'd sent in to have to a very high-tech mercury testing lab to see if there was any traces of methyl mercury or mercury in the wood, and there was zero. There was nothing but background. So, either the section of the ship I found isn't the section that had the mercury on it, or it was successfully removed. My conjectured theory is that the wreck ran ashore, like the native story says, under duress with 2 ships firing cannon upon it. And that's how the original native, or one of the many stories go, was that there was a ship battle between 2 ships, and the ship ran ashore. If the ship ran ashore because it was sinking, or was in distress or had just blown ashore in distress, the first step you would do would be to remove your cargo so you can refloat it and careen it. And so I believe that the mercury and a good portion of the porcelain was taken off. And I believe that's what some of the rocks on the mountain, like the W rock and some of that stuff, signify. And that's what the other treasure hunters over the years, I think, believe that those rocks all signify to where treasure was buried. Some of them I do believe are that. And some of them I believe are where the mineral claims of the minerals around here that they were taking out, because a lot of the rock art that's on the mountain in the form of glyphs is mostly glyphs that you would find from like a 1400s alchemist or a 1500 alchemist. It's old. It's the old way of taking out mining claims, putting up, marked rocks, putting monuments up. Somebody comes back later on to dispute your monument. You say, no, I got a rock over there buried and I'll go show it to you, so we were here first. There is the dispute of whether Drake was up here. And I'm a pretty solid believer in that from the evidence that I have saw from some other things. And potentially, there's some other anomalies up here that would, make me think that Drake was up here at Tillamook Bay, not Netarts, not Little Whale Cove, not anywhere else on the coast, but Tillamook Bay in particular, mostly because his map matches Tillamook Bay. The rocks on his map, on the Honda's map, behind his ship are the same rocks that you see in Tillamook Bay that are called sow and pigs. And behind his ship on those rocks, or by those rocks, is a large black column. And I believe that was his post. And I believe it was made out of the pink granite stone that I found. And there's a couple of things that I found during my commercial clamming dive operations over the years that I'd like to have somebody come and take a really hard look at, because I believe it's pink granite. I believe they're their careening anchors from either the Galleon or Drake or somebody prior. There's three main prevalent ship stories in the area from the natives in different people's diaries that were the local first homesteaders. A guy named Vaughn wrote a pretty extensive history of the area, and he talks about the Tillamook spit wreck of 1679 that the natives talked about. That's also confirmed in another diary that there was a wreck on Tillamook Spit in 1679, but it was one lone survivor, and he was an Asian, and he helped the tribe learn how to build better craft, canoes, and that he built three larger craft in Vaughn's diary from what the natives had told him, and had basically freebooted the other tribes around here because they had an advantage. And it is interesting that the Tillamook, or the Killamook, as they were called originally, were a pretty powerful tribe. They also had, the Black Chief Kelchis, and there were other people that were probably off of ships in the past that were living with the natives, like Jack Ramsey. He was the redheaded Nehalem native that had Jack Ramsey tattooed on his arm, and he claimed that his father was off of a ship, that had wrecked at the mouth of the Columbia. So then you have the story in the natives' legends about ships shooting at each other and one running ashore. That's probably the Beeswax wreck. And then you have the natives talking about a wreck off in Nehalem, or at Nehalem. That was a strange wreck, they called it. And so that wreck had iron on it because Vaughn and the other local Tillamook homesteaders actually made trucks over there to take metal off of it, because metal was hard for them to come by when they were building the boat, the Gull, I think it was, in Tillamook Bay, one of the first boats they used to go to Portland and get potatoes and bring them back, because the locals here survived off of potatoes and salmon for the first quite a few years. It was rare for them to have flour or anything else, be able to even get it in here. things didn't really start to, pick up for the local natives, or I mean, the local settlers here, until they started bringing cattle in. The local natives here and the local settlers were like family. They got along great. The local natives took care of the settlers. The settlers helped the natives. It was a very communal area for a long time until after the Civil War, when an army regiment came out to Portland, and they'd heard a story about a native that had accidentally killed a lady in a house fire. He had gone in and tried to get some alcohol and knocked a lamp over, and the husband was gone, and the lady ended up perishing. And Chief Kelch just kicked him out of the tribe and banished him, and had punished him pretty severely at the time. But some army guys were all hot from the Indian Wars, decided to come down here and round the guy up and hang him out at Sandstone Point on their sacred tree. At that point in time, a battle about erupted. But Trask and a couple of the other locals went and met with the natives and talked them down, and they all started getting along again. So until they got later taken to reservations. So that's kind of a wrap up on that part of the, little bit of the native story with in regards to the shipwreck.
Yeah, that was one of the parts that I was interested in hearing is, how so often when we're in a situation here where we're looking at all this research in these histories, and very often there are these native oral histories or written in some cases that have been passed down. When you do have this other research come in and really confirm and really uphold a lot of the stories that the natives have been sharing for decades, for centuries. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of the Beeswax wreck, is seeing those histories, especially in a place here where you talked about, having multiple instances of wrecks on the coast, and how those stories exist and how they do sometimes get conflated, with the retelling, and how certain details kind of drift into each other. It makes for a very rich, story to discuss here. Kind of an all-encompassing theme from all the stuff you've been discussing here, whether it's the native stories, the other local stories, and even just the idea of sort of trying to reconstruct the story of what may have happened to those on board the Beeswax wreck. It's a common theme. It's a theme that we try to focus on this show is the fact that, for a lot of the wrecks we talk about, whether they're older or more modern, we tend to think of them as a wreck. When in reality, they're in fact, the people that were involved with this story and the people who were affected by the story. So I think all of these things, you talk about the oral histories, the legends, and then also just, how people in the area, everyone's got a story, everyone's got, a piece of wax, a piece of porcelain. And I think that is kind of a good way to sort of highlight the presence of a wreck, in a community, in an area, and how that is, far bigger than just, the planks of wood, the pieces of, the artifacts, whatever. It's kind of a theme that we like to stress on the show, is that even in situations where you might not think a certain wreck is influential or has a big presence somewhere, it definitely is. These all work together really well. So I guess, let's see, we're coming towards some of my final questions here. And I don't know if there's more you wanted to share. I know you talked a little bit about some of the beachcombing stuff. I know with legal stuff, there's probably not always a ton of stuff you can share, but was there anything else from that perspective you needed to share?
So one of my big concerns about, the beachcombing and people being able to come down to the coast and enjoy, looking for things on the beach is, finding porcelain by chance and having a chance to maybe be involved with the story. It's it's everybody's, best moment sometimes when you make a discovery, and it really sets like a good feeling in a person's soul. That that being said, many locals have made many discoveries over the years on the beaches that they've taken home, not knowing what it was they found or knowing exactly what they found. My big concern with this in the future is there are a lot of people that are afraid to come forward with things that their ancestors, their family have found because they're afraid that somebody will take it away from them. And there's a ton of data to be gleaned by all that. I heard there's a lady that has a giant door to the ship that's all carved that was found on the beach that she won't, I've heard it from several different contractors that wouldn't tell me who she was. They all, upheld their vow to not say who. But, I would love for people like her and other people that have something sitting on their mantle of their, fireplace to not be afraid to take it down to the Nehalem Valley Historical Society. So it's super important that the message gets out there that it's okay to find something that's washing around on the beach that's not in situ. If you don't know what it is, are you ever going to know what it is if you leave it there and it washes away? No, and neither were the archaeologists. So in order for people to go down to the beach and not be afraid to pick something up, at one aspect they're putting out all this money in advertisement to bring tourists to the coast, but then when people get here, there's nothing to do. And if you can't go to the beach and find things, which is what a lot of people go to the beach for, or dig a hole because you think there's a treasure chest buried there as a kid, it's just wrong. And we're not going to glean any more of the already found historical data out there. Now, granted, it's not in situ. It may not give us all the answers because it was found by somebody in the 50s and put on a mantle. But at the same time, when the Naga Beeswax project started, they had a lot of people coming forward with things at first. And one of the coolest things that I saw somebody come forward was that I hadn't seen up to that point was a piece of wax that had porcelain and terracotta pottery in it, and it had been melted in a fire, which was similar to the same piece of the first object that I actually ever found from the shipwreck, which is a piece of wax in one of my crab pots that had been melted in a fire. And then I could tell by looking at the piece of wax that I found that it was wax, that it had tar from the ship melted into it. It had some wood splinters, which at this point in time, I'd really like an analysis done to see if it matches the wood that I found later. And you could even see where the fish had been chewing on it on the bottom. You could see which sides were oxidized from being, up, and you could actually see fish bite marks, on it. It's up at the museum. It's one of those things that'd be really cool to be out on an actual display because more research needs to be done. Stuff is disappearing out of the caves. It's being lost to history. Granted, some more of the other pieces of wood aren't going to tell us a lot more other than it's another piece of the same kind of wood. But nobody knows how these ships were completely constructed. Anything that I find or anybody else finds that has, a spike hole here or a spike hole there in it might be all the data we need to add one more piece to a puzzle that's, a much greater, bigger puzzle.
So I know you talked a little bit about, some of the other things you'd like to see tested. So, I mean, from your perspective, aside from getting these things, on display. So I was going to ask a question here about, because this is kind of a local, this is a relatively well-known aspect of, to people who are interested in shipwrecks, people who are interested in specifically the Pacific Northwest. Are there plans? Have there been discussions of having, some kind of special display for stuff from the Beeswax wreck?
There's not really any major plans, that I'm aware of for the material that I found as a yet to be displayed by anybody else, other than the Nehalem Valley Historical Society. I've put some pieces in there on loan, and the majority of it's up at the Columbia River Maritime Museum. I'm kind of mixed between wanting to see it distributed through different museums so that it's in a lot of places so people can see it, and having a dedicated museum in the area. I think we can have both. With an artifact sharing program. I know, like the Oregon Coast Aquarium, who I supply clams for their otters for, has displayed an interest in it, in having some pieces to display down there and tell the story. I'm sure any other museum around would be glad to, have some of it on display if they have the finances in the room to display it. I think that's the biggest problem with trying to do anything with this or any other wreck is there's this giant bottleneck in conservation, and there's very little monies out there for the museums to operate with. It's not like they're made of money and they can just do all this stuff. The Maritime Museum in Astoria just got done rebuilding their entire Beeswax shipwreck display right before I found the wreck, or the wood and stuff. So kind of threw that into a loop for them to be able to display it, because they'd already done what they were planning on doing. They never expected this to happen. And at the same time, I'd like to see some, the people whose this ship affected, in Manila, Mexico, and Spain have possible opportunity to display these artifacts that are found here. I'd really like to see a really large, focused museum built, maybe in Wheeler or Manzanita, up above the tsunami line, for it. I don't necessarily. The Maritime Museum makes me a little leery because it's right there on the Columbia River, and I'd hate shipwreck get washed away again.
Right.
If something happens, because we're this Cascadia fault line out here is a ticking time bomb, and you never know. It happened while we're talking on this podcast.
Yeah.
I would like to move that forward in a way. I was going to put up a GoFundMe site, but I got told through other people by state parks to take it down, which I don't think they had the right to do that. And I'll put it back up. And I would like to, on my own, build a museum dedicated to it, just like my grandfather built the League of Nations Flag Museum in Brooklyn, Iowa, which they now call the City of Flags. And I would, like to try to proceed beyond his, footsteps in history by building a dedicated museum to this at some point in time. Throw all my hard-earned work into it at some point in time. I'd really like to have a conservation lab built in the local area that could not only house and try to, curate stuff from this wreck, but wrecks abroad. There's a huge bottleneck with just a couple of institutions capable of doing, conservation. And I have some friends that have a lot of experience in that. I have people that would help on almost a volunteer basis, and I have investor friends that would probably be willing to put in on all this. It's just a matter of making sure that we can move forward with this.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be my kind of concluding question here. Is obviously your big focus is on the Beeswax wreck. Are there other wrecks that are of special interest to you that you would like to see preserved, or even just getting the story out there?
Yes, very much so. There's a number of mysteries along here that I would like to solve, and I'm going to go over a brief list. There's what's referred to as the Lincoln City wreck. Surfers down there find porcelain all the time. It's a different style of porcelain than what I find. It looks more Korean. to me, from what I've seen. It's definitely older. It's more worn out in the sand, and it's definitely been washing around longer than the stuff from the Galleon. Um, some of the wood that I found in the cave, at least one piece of wood that I found in the cave, um, which is a slightly different kind of wood, and that is a natural, gyre collection spot there where the ship got washed in there. It got washed in there for reasons. Where one wreck is at, there's usually another. Um, I found another piece of the same kind of wood in another location pretty close, and the carbon dates on those came back from 1425 as opposed to 1639.
Wow. Yeah.
So, that predates Columbus. That is probably an Asian wreck that just washed over here, probably from Japan or Korea, or possibly a ship that was coming from China to Japan. Ships from China that washed off in typhoons and stuff generally don't get in the right currents to just wash over here by accident. It was mostly the Japanese current that pulls stuff over here. So it would have had to been an Indian ship going to trade with Japan, or a Chinese ship, something like that, and that had washed over here. That I would say is referred to as the Lincoln City wreck. My friend Bill Calkins, that bought one of my crab boat from me years back, his grandfather was county commissioner of Lincoln County, and his dad both had discovered what they call the Salmon River wreck. Maybe the same source of porcelain that the Lincoln City wreck I just referred to is. It's all the one and the same. But they had tried to excavate it back. I think it was in the 40s and maybe even into the 50s. He even took a tractor out in Follette, or in the Salmon River there, and started bulldozing it out. The state shut him down. He ended up fighting the state, got salvage rights to it, and the family still holds salvage rights to it, from what I understand, according to Bill Calkins. Bill Calkins used to own that boat, the Seabrook, on Deadliest Catch. He was a
Okay.
king crabber up in Alaska, and he bought my crab boat, and we were out there, going to run some gear, show him my boat, and we started talking, shipwrecks, and here I am looking for this one, and here his dad was looking for that one, and he told me a lot of details, how they augured down into the hold of it, and there was no cargo in it, and that was a big reason they gave up on continuing to work it really hard. They didn't find any evidence of anything in the hold when they'd augured into it several times. I know the depths of where they hit the wood at, and all kinds of things, and where the general area is. A few years back, Bob Ward, I think, hired Mitch Markham to go up and do some augering and survey for it, but they didn't, or magnetometer work, but I don't think they found anything. But then they also don't know, somebody else has salvage rights to it, or at least, Mitch didn't until I told him about all this. But
Right.
Bill Calkins lives in Florida now. He's not doing that good. He has brain cancer, from what I understand, so I hope he's doing all right. That's one of the wrecks I've had an interest in, because I've seen porcelain from it. I've seen physical evidence of it. Is that the 1425 wreck that the wood washed up the coast and ended up, I find later? What's interesting this is what caught my eye about the wood too, because the piece of wood that I found, and it's the piece that I show in the Drain the Oceans National Geographic when the producer Wayne asked me, do you have any wood around here you think is from a shipwreck? It doesn't have to be from the Galleon, but it's just a piece of wood you found on the beach that you thought, that's driftwoody, that you thought was a shipwreck wood. And I says, well, yeah, I got this one in my shop, which I had to wade in through because I was trying to build a dive compressor and a bunch of stuff in there at the time. But I waded in there and I pulled that stick out for the camera. At the time, not knowing what it was, I sent it up to the museum not long after that, because like I said in there, I'd wanted to show Scott, and they say, you never know what it's going to tell you. Well, they sent the carbon dates in on it, and it turned out to be a type of wood called supa from Asia, which obviously came across the ocean on something, and was dated at 1425. So
Wow.
probably not associated to the same wreck. What's interesting is the cane that's in the Tillamook Museum that Ben Lane made is made of the same wood. So I would think that that where Ben Lane was getting his wood was a completely different wreck than the wood I found in the cave. And I think it's the anomaly we found when we were out with Brennan Sheldon, out in front of Manzanita there in the, kind of in the corner. There was a magnetometer anomaly there. It wasn't a very big one. We also figured out, where the Mimi was, and a few other locations. So the other shipwreck or I should say sub-wreck I would like to research would be the Cape Lookout submarine. It's been a mystery since the 40s when it was bombed. I was sitting at the Fisherman's Corner eating breakfast one morning, and a guy sitting there next to me with an old Navy hat on. Started talking to him. His name was Pat Patterson. He told me the story about sitting in the radio operator's tower or the operator station on Cape Lookout during the war when they bombed a submarine with depth charges from an aircraft. And I'm not sure if they used a blimp, but I think he said it was a bomber at the time. And they had depth charged something off of Cape Lookout, thought to be a sub. So over the years, there's been a lot of conjecture as to what that was. There was another lady, Kathy, and her husband Anderson was looking for it, I think, in the past. Never really got anywhere, I don't think. I've got the numbers from drag fishermen where it's at because they've hung up on it a few times. In 1950 or 51, drag fishermen out of Garibaldi actually pulled up part of the conning tower and a hatch that had Japanese writing on it and brought it in and set it in front of the Hoy Brothers building, cannery. And it sat there until 1954 when the newspaper in Tillamook did an article on it. And I found out that, it disappeared right after that. And that was, for a long time, was a mystery as to why. But I was talking to one of the really old port guys down there, and he said that the military basically came in and made the port buried in a cement wall because they didn't want to have to maybe go out and figure out where it was at and return bodies to Japan or something. But so that was covered up. But there's a lot of conjecture out there, like Kathy believes it's an American sub that we sunk on accident. And there's a little evidence to go that direction. It's kind of convoluted that there's a Japanese hatch and stuff that came up with writing on it. And I can go into that a little more detail about it in just a second. But the fact that there's another story also about a submarine bombing from an airplane. Brett Holstrom was flying an airplane off the Columbia River and dropped depth charges on something and sank. It was confirmed that there was an oil slick by some of the other airplanes. I had my friend Ty Grabowski tell me a bunch of data on that. It was interesting that there was a Japanese submarine that made it back to Japan with a failed mission, and its mission was to fire its cannon in on the city of Seattle on Christmas Eve of 1940. I don't know. I'll have to look at the cup that has the date on it. But he was supposed, that was his mission. Found out that, the sub made it back. But what the theory is he was charging his batteries with the diesel generator floating out off the Columbia River the day before, because I think it was just a couple of days before Christmas that they'd done that bombing run on the thing off the Columbia River. It was standard procedure for a submarine with a mini sub on it, if they were spotted by air, to release the mini submarine as a decoy. And so they probably got away and left the decoy there, and Brett bombed it. and that would make some sense. And then that would make sense too, was for the smaller hatch that ended up getting brought into the Hoy Brothers building years later. That was later, disappeared. So there's that I would really like to follow up on some further, offshore research with some ROVs and some, high tech stuff that hasn't ever been looked at. Some of the spots where I got numbers from some of the drag fishermen in the past.
Yeah, that's it's fascinating, especially with something like World War II, something that is just so extremely well, thoroughly documented, but still having these stories that are a little bit fallen through the cracks, and we don't have a open and shut explanation for things. It's just fascinating that those stories can still exist, even today.
I'm pretty sure I have some smoking gun proof to the identity of at least this one location that's thought to be as a sub. It's probably an American, whatever it is. It's an American ship or sub. I had a friend of mine, Dave Vandecouver, and I drag fished with in the past. He knew the area out here, just as good as anybody, and he gave me a cup of Shimano ware that was from the site that he drug up in this dragnet, and it's got numbers on the bottom. It's got a date on the bottom. It's got the Shimano ware, factory numbers. Now, I called up the Shimano ware company in Seattle, in back east there, and they, I think it was in New York, and they tried to do some archival research for me and told me that, all those records were purposely destroyed during the war, even though they never really ever put, information on the bottom of their cups and bowls unless it was a military order. And it's interesting that this, cup dates, right from the perfect period of time, came out of this area that's known by the drag fishermen as being the subsite. And, it's got these numbers on it, but the numbers ended up kind of falling, on, into nowhere because they destroyed all those records to protect, soldiers during World War II from, them being able to use those numbers to somehow track information back on us from our enemy. So there's also, and I have the number to the actual minesweeper. Pat Patterson had told me that over the years after they had bombed the submarine out there, that they'd used that site as a purposeful depth charge target area and had purposely just obliterated it as much as they could to wipe it off the map. And so, does that mean that there was some sort of a cover up, or does that mean, they didn't want to have to do reprimands? I don't know, but it's, that was out of the horse's mouth back in the day, and it makes you go, whoa.
I've heard crazier theories than the U.S. military having to cover things up before.
Oh, I know. So, but there was a minesweeper that sank itself out there. So this cup may have come off of it. It's like a captain's shaving mug is what my friend gave me. And, I'd exhausted, any possible research that could be done on this, but it came from a site that we could go back out to and look at more. There's a bunch of other, we have the Columbia River here with more shipwrecks on it than most places in the entire world. And there's no program to be like recovering history or searching for history out here, really. State of Oregon doesn't even have a paid marine archaeologist, and neither does the state of Washington, from what I understand. And then I was ousted from being able to go out there the day of the recovery by the state park manager. That was the defining reason that was the defining reason why they weren't going to let anybody go out there, was because I discovered it and I wasn't an archaeologist and I wasn't allowed to be able to go out there and participate in it. And so I ended up getting ousted on the actual day of the recovery of the big beam. I'd even spent a whole lot of money on all of the things that it would have taken to recover it in a way more archaeological, common sense way of doing it. Now, does that Like, how does that make any sense?
Right. Yeah. It seems like you would be like the person to talk to.
It's because I don't have a degree. It's because I'm an amateur researcher. And then Scott will tell you the exact same thing, and it frustrates the hell out of him and a lot of other people, because I know more about this than Scott or anyone else. And I'm not just trying to swell my head up there. Scott's been coming to me. Other people have been coming to me for years asking, if I could, help. Scott is an extremely well disciplined, skeptical archaeologist, and his skepticism has kept me a little more grounded from going off on crazy, research tangents, and has kept me focused and has kept me doing the right thing also, as opposed to just, hey, I can go take this. And I believe that we need to, step forward away from the past of this bureaucracy quagmire that's happened, and start doing some proper research out there again. Law is a ever changing aspect, and there is a law that was wrote that says the state owns shipwrecks in their waters, but that law was wrote for another state, and other states adopted it. And so I have two firms of lawyers that are willing to work with it, and the Northwest Shipwreck Alliance, which is working on the Pacific, um, to potentially try to move this forward in a way that will benefit all Oregonians and people around the world, to enlighten them on our history here and their own history. I mean, this affected people in Manila. There could be people there that still, they'd lost people on that ship, probably don't have connections to it anymore, but, it still goes back to Manila. There were probably Filipinos on the ship working. One of the native legends was that the survivors all had ponytails, so it might have only been the Filipinos that survived the wreck. It may be another whole wreck that they're talking about. If there were only 30 castaways on the galleon that lived with the natives for a while until they had relation disputes with their wives, and they ended up running them and burning them out of the Nehalem camp, according to the stories. And those refugees ran up onto the mountain into some caves and stayed there till they died. In the 80s, I think it was 83, Ed Fire was a big treasure hunter, super religious, guy, overly religious guy. Believed God was telling him where the shipwreck was and all this other stuff. He was actively digging on Neoconi Mountain in these cave shafts and found skeletons. And those skeletons were, a big deal. All of a sudden, the state came in, from what I understood, had the natives come in and look at them. The natives said, "Nope, we didn't bury our people underground like that." And the state said, "Well, we're burying it anyway, taking this away from Ed. You can't work here anymore. We're going to put a Treasure Trove Act in," and adopted the Treasure Trove Act in, I think it was in 91, which says you just can't go look for a treasure in Oregon, and which is crazy. How would they ever expect to get anybody to come forward with anything?
Right.
States like Florida and the Carolinas, where you can go out and you find something and the state gets their percentage. People bring the stuff forward all the time, and that's why history is so convoluted here. Is that people don't want to bring things forward when they do find them. I might be an exception to that rule. I knew a long time ago I wasn't going to be able to keep any treasure or whatever I found necessarily without some sort of super battle, which is kind of going on. But like I said before, I don't want to just keep the shipwreck, harvest the gold out of it, and be a big treasure hunter salver on it. I'm more interested in the history of it. I harvest Drake's clams that he talked about or that Fletcher talked about in the story that survived the fire that lost most of Drake's records. Fletcher says they lived off of cockles and wolves. I don't know very many other bays on our coast that there's enough cockles to survive off of for a whole crew. And so, I joke all the time that I'm out harvesting the treasure all the time.
Very nice.
And I get 150,000 pounds of clams a year with my crew. And it's a super sustainable fishery. I'm on the Tillamook Bay Clam Advisory Board or Committee, Tillamook Bay Clam Advisory Committee. And, we have a very extremely sustainable fishery. Mostly, in fact, because when we harvest the clams, they spawn and make millions more. And I've actually seen an increase as we've been harvesting clams across the bay, of clams, settling in and growing in areas they never used to grow. I'm kind of like Johnny Apple Clam.
Very
So
nice.
when it comes down to it, and so are the other guys that are out harvesting clams in my competition. There's 10 permits on the coast, and only a few of them are active, and only a few of us are really after it. I've been doing it longer than the rest of these guys that are the guys that are in it right now, and I'm considering leasing or selling my business out and going full time into this research conservation, museum mode here, sometime in the future. So it's kind of where I'm at. There's a lot of other stuff that surrounds this research that we can make another whole, podcast story about. Probably make 20 of them that'll be
Sure.
as complicated and as detailed as this, in order to actually, step on all the stones of the story, because, it's there's that much to it. It's just been there's been so much stuff done out here. I could show you some glyphs on Neocani Mountain that would, make people go, whoa. And I'd really like to have some people come out with some, with the right equipment and do some real good tests on some of this stuff, on the lichens that are growing in the glyphs, on the, the types of glyphs. A lot of the glyphs are modern. I mean, there's a ton of modern glyphs, people, I love such and such and such and such, all over the mountain. But there's also these old ones, and you can tell they're old. I mean, who makes a glyph of a rectangle? Like, for no reason. But if you look in Cameron Lafayette's book of the crew list, one of the crew lists actual sign was that, because they didn't sign their names, but they made symbols. And so, is that actual crew member's glyph on the mountain? Right there, not very far from the cannon impacts that are on the mountain, the grape shot, and not very far from the 1381 date that also was pounded out and defaced and like messed with a couple of times throughout history. Like, obviously somebody was trying to pound out somebody else's land claim, potentially. There's even a cross staff pinhole, or a peg hole, where you put your staff to do cross staff surveying from that type of era and time, right there as well. So there's some really interesting things that can be researched, from rock art to the porcelain spread out throughout the beaches, the potential vault, the grave sites that are up there, the work that other treasure hunters had done. They may have been onto something in those spots, and then just never were quite right, but probably not. But they would have found something if they were there.
Yeah, it's it seems like an almost bottomless source of stories and research to be done.
It is. It's hard for me, knowing it all, to wrap my head around it, to even know what to talk about. Sometimes there's just so much to it. It's phenomenal, and it's a great mystery, type of history, solving. And that's one of my favorite things in the world, is historical mysteries, whatever it is, wherever it is. Like, I mean, we have some of the oldest cultures in this area, 13,000 years, Terry Clark, the guy I worked with over at the Dust Devil Sunstone mines, I think it was his grandfather found those, 13 or 14,000 year old slippers, or whatever you call them, footwear, in the cave over there by Lake Edel. And, that's, that's a long time to have culture in this area, people living in this area. And if you look at all the history of the Aztecs and the other stuff, there's a lot of that going down in New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, northern or Southern California, and the trail kind of leads up this direction. And there's some there may be some tie-ins to that. It's far flung and be really hard to prove, but there's so many angles of research that can be done up here for people that a lot of people can get involved and enjoy themselves in further research and archaeology in the future over all of these stories, and try to get rid of some of the convoluted stories and sort them out, see what actually shakes out of the tree for real. So
cool. Well, yeah, I think hopefully we're able to maybe we'll be able to continue this at some other time. But there's endless amount of things we could talk about with this wreck. But for now, I think we'll wrap things here. I would just like to say thank you for all of your time, all the effort you've put into sharing all of this stuff with us. All this research, all of the searching that you've done. Yeah, like we really appreciate it. Again, like I said at the beginning, it's rare we get to talk to someone with so much hands-on experience with one of our, one of the stories that we talk about. So yeah, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the getting to sit down and talk about it and tell the story, and I hope everybody enjoyed it, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we will sign off here, and then we will be back with more Shipwreck content for you next week. So take care, everyone, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks again to Craig for joining us to talk about his experiences with the Beeswax wreck. If you're interested in further reading on this topic, check out the special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly focused on the Beeswax wreck. Several of the articles from that issue went into making part 1 of this episode. We look forward to any future developments in the story, and thanks to all of you for listening, and again, for your patience during the gap between part 1 and part 2. Till next time, take care.